All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're gonna tackle something well, pretty familiar to most people, I think, right? I mean, who hasn't used ibuprofen at some point?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's just, practically a universal experience, I think, whether it's for a headache or pulled muscle or a fever. It's almost like a first aid kit staple.
Exactly. But I think it's easy to forget or maybe just never really consider all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes to get that little pill into your hand.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's where this deep dive is going to be really interesting. We're going to peel back the layers, started with its history. It's kind of a fascinating origin story, actually. Did you know it was initially developed as a gentler alternative to aspirin?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
And that really got me thinking about how our understanding of a drug can shift over time,
Right.
right? It starts with this specific purpose, and then as we gain more experience with it, we discover, oh, it can do this too, and even this.
That's a great point. And I think that's definitely true with ibuprofen. I mean, today it's used for a huge range of things, not just what it was originally intended for.
Exactly. So where do we start with this origin story? So let's go back in time.
Okay, so picture this. It's the 1950s, and a team of researchers at Boots, the British pharmaceutical company, is working on a pretty ambitious project. They want to find a new anti-inflammatory drug, something that could help people with conditions like arthritis, but without the harsh side effects that were often associated with the go-to option at the time, which was aspirin.
Right. And aspirin was, I mean, it was effective for pain and inflammation, but it could be really rough on the stomach, especially if you had to take it regularly.
Exactly. So this team at Boots, led by a physician named Dr. Stewart Adams and a chemist named John Nicholson, they start systematically testing different compounds, trying to find that magic molecule that would hit the right target without causing too much trouble elsewhere.
So it was a very targeted approach, not like a, just stumbling upon it kind of thing.
Right. It was very deliberate research. And eventually, after years of work and a lot of testing, they synthesized the compound that we now know as ibuprofen.
In 1961, if I remember
That
correctly.
was a big year.
Yeah.
1961, they synthesized the lead compound, and then the following year, in 1962, they secure the patent, which is absolutely crucial in the world of pharmaceutical development.
Right, because that patent essentially gives them exclusive rights to produce and sell the drug
Yeah.
for a certain period of time, which is, I guess, necessary to recoup the costs of research and development.
It's a huge investment. I mean, bringing a new drug to market can cost hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, so that patent protection is really essential to make it a viable venture.
So they've got the compound, they've got the patent. What happens next? This is where clinical trials come in, right?
Exactly. Before any new drug can be approved for use in humans, it has to go through rigorous testing to make sure it's both effective, it actually does what it's supposed to do, and safe, the benefits outweigh the risks.
Right, and the first step in that process is usually testing it on animals in a lab setting.
Yep. And once the preclinical studies show promising results, then you can move on to human trials. And the first human trials for ibuprofen were conducted in Edinburgh starting in 1966.
And I read that these initial trials were focused on patients with rheumatoid arthritis, which makes sense given the whole motivation for developing ibuprofen in the first place, right? To find something that could help people manage chronic inflammation without the stomach issues that aspirin often cause.
Absolutely. Rheumatoid arthritis was kind of a logical first target because it's a condition that requires long-term anti-inflammatory treatment. So it was really important to find something that people could take safely for extended periods.
So how did ibuprofen perform in those early trials?
Well, the results were pretty encouraging. It showed good efficacy in reducing pain and inflammation in these patients. And importantly, it had a much better safety profile compared to aspirin, particularly when it came to gastrointestinal side effects.
And all of that led to its first approval for use in humans, right?
Exactly. In 1969, ibuprofen was launched in the United Kingdom as a prescription-only medication under the brand name Brufen.
So initially it was only available for specific conditions like rheumatic diseases.
That's right. And the initial dosage recommendations were actually fairly conservative, I think, reflecting a kind of cautious approach to a new medication, especially one intended for long-term use. But as doctors gained more experience with it and more research was done, it became clear that ibuprofen could also be really effective for a much wider range of conditions, including things like acute pain, headaches, and fever.
And that, I guess, paved the way for its eventual move to over-the-counter status, right?
Absolutely. That was a major turning point. In 1983, ibuprofen became available over the counter in the UK under the brand name Nurofen.
And then just a year later, in 1984, the U.S. followed suit, approving it for over-the-counter sale under brands like Advil and Motrin IB, which are probably the names that most people are familiar with today.
Yeah, those are the big ones. And that shift to OTC status really changed the game for ibuprofen. Suddenly, it was accessible to anyone. You know, you didn't need a prescription. You could just walk into a pharmacy or even a grocery store and buy it.
Which must have had a huge impact on how people managed everyday aches and pains and fevers.
It was a major shift in the whole approach to self-care. People had more control over managing their own minor health issues, and I think it probably contributed to a significant decrease in unnecessary doctor visits for things that people could now handle themselves.
Right, and then in 1985, Boots' worldwide patent on ibuprofen expired, which meant that other companies could start producing and selling their own generic versions of the drug.
Yeah, that was another key moment. The expiration of the patent led to a massive increase in the availability of ibuprofen and a pretty dramatic decrease in the
So
price.
suddenly it became much more affordable and accessible to even more people.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point to consider because, pain relief should be something that everyone has access to, not just those who can afford to pay for brand name medications.
Right, and ibuprofen is now on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, which kind of underscores its importance as a basic healthcare need.
Absolutely. And the development of ibuprofen was truly a groundbreaking achievement. It really did change how we approach pain management, and it's had a profound impact on global health. In fact, the discovery of ibuprofen was even recognized with the Queen's Award for Technological Achievement in 1985, and Dr. Adams himself was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire, or OBE, in 1987 for his contributions to medicine.
So it was a big deal, both scientifically and culturally. But I think it's fascinating to see how that initial focus on chronic conditions and finding something that was well tolerated for long-term use might have initially kind of masked its full potential for tackling acute pain as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I think sometimes our initial understanding of a drug's capabilities can be a bit limited. It takes time and further research and clinical experience to fully appreciate everything that it can do.
All right, well, we've covered the origin story. We've gotten ibuprofen into the hands of the people. I guess the next big question is, how does this stuff actually work?
Okay, so to understand how ibuprofen works, we need to dive into a bit of biochemistry. Are you ready for this?
Always.
All right, so ibuprofen belongs to a class of drugs called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. And as the name suggests, NSAIDs work primarily by reducing inflammation, but they also have analgesic effects, meaning they reduce pain, and antipyretic effects, meaning they lower fever.
Right, and ibuprofen it's probably the most well-known and widely used NSAID out there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's certainly up there. Now, the key to how ibuprofen and other NSAIDs work lies in their ability to block the action of enzymes called cyclooxygenases, or TOX enzymes. These TOX enzymes are involved in the production of prostaglandins, which are kind of like signaling molecules that play a role in a whole bunch of bodily processes, including inflammation, pain, and fever.
So prostaglandins they're kind of like the messengers that tell your body, hey, there's something going on here, you need to pay attention.
Exactly. So when you get injured, when you have an infection, your body releases these prostaglandins to trigger the inflammatory response, which is, it's actually a good thing in many cases. It helps protect your body and promote healing. But sometimes, this inflammatory response can be a bit overzealous, and it can lead to pain, swelling, and other uncomfortable symptoms.
So that's where ibuprofen steps in, right? It blocks those messengers, those prostaglandins, and kind of tells the body to chill out a bit.
Exactly. Ibuprofen works by inhibiting or blocking the activity of those COX enzymes. And by doing so, it reduces the production of prostaglandins and therefore dampens down the inflammatory response.
Now, I remember reading that there are actually two main types of COX enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2.
You're right. COX-1 is involved in a lot of normal physiological processes, things like protecting the lining of your stomach, regulating blood flow to the kidneys, and promoting blood clotting. So it's kind of like a housekeeping enzyme. It's important for maintaining the day-to-day functions of your body.
And COX-2, that's the one that's more involved in the inflammatory response, right?
Exactly. COX-2 is primarily produced at sites of inflammation, so it's more of a specialist enzyme that gets called upon when there's a need to ramp up the inflammatory response.
And ibuprofen blocks both of them, right?
That's right. Ibuprofen is what we call a non-selective COX inhibitor, meaning it inhibits both COX-1 and COX-2.
So that's both good and bad, right? I mean, blocking COX-2 is what helps reduce inflammation and pain, but blocking COX-1 can lead to some of the potential side effects that we associate with ibuprofen, like stomach upset.
Precisely. That's why it's so important to use ibuprofen responsibly and to follow the recommended dosage guidelines.
Absolutely. Now, I also remember reading something about ibuprofen existing as two different forms, or enantiomers. Can you explain what that means and why it's relevant?
Yeah, that's a really interesting aspect of ibuprofen's chemistry. So enantiomers are molecules that are mirror images of each other. Imagine your left and right hand, they're the same shape, but they're not superimposable, right?
Right, they're kind of like opposites, but the same.
Exactly. So ibuprofen exists as two enantiomers called R-ibuprofen and S-ibuprofen. And they both have the same chemical formula, but they have slightly different three-dimensional structures.
And this difference in structure actually affects how they interact with your body, right?
It does. Only the S enantiomer of ibuprofen is pharmacologically active, meaning it's the one that actually binds to those COX enzymes and produces the desired effects of reducing inflammation and pain.
So what about the R enantiomer? Does it do anything?
Well, the R enantiomer is largely inactive. It doesn't bind to the COX enzymes as effectively as the S enantiomer. However, it's not completely useless. Some of it can actually be converted into the active S enantiomer in the body through a process called chiral inversion.
So your body can kind of recycle the inactive form into the active form. That's pretty neat.
Yeah, it is. It's a pretty remarkable example of how the body can manipulate and utilize different forms of molecules.
So most ibuprofen products that you buy, they contain a mixture of both enantiomers, right?
That's right. It's what we call a racemic mixture, a 50-50 mixture of the R and S enantiomers.
Okay. Now, I think it'd be helpful to compare ibuprofen to some other common over-the-counter pain relievers, like acetaminophen and aspirin. I mean, how do they stack up against each other?
That's a great question, and it's one that comes up a lot. People want to know what's the best option for their particular situation. So let's start with acetaminophen, which is also known as paracetamol in some parts of the world.
Right, and it's the active ingredient in Tylenol and a bunch of other over-the-counter pain relievers.
Exactly. So acetaminophen and ibuprofen, they're both effective at reducing pain and fever, but they work in different ways. Acetaminophen is thought to work primarily in the central nervous system, in the brain and spinal cord, whereas ibuprofen acts more peripherally, at the site of inflammation.
And that difference in where they act actually has some practical implications for how we use them, right?
It does. Because ibuprofen has that direct anti-inflammatory effect, it's generally considered to be more effective for pain that's associated with inflammation, like muscle aches, sprains, arthritis, that kind of thing. Acetaminophen is more often used for pain that's not as inflammatory in nature, like headaches or general aches and pains.
So if you've got a pulled muscle or a sprained ankle, ibuprofen is probably the better choice.
Yeah, in those situations, ibuprofen is usually going to give you better relief, and it's also generally more effective for reducing fever, especially in children.
And then there's aspirin, which, as we mentioned earlier, was kind of the original go-to for pain and inflammation before ibuprofen came along.
Right. Aspirin is another NSAID, so it works in a similar way to ibuprofen, but it has some key differences. One of the main differences is that aspirin's effect on platelets is irreversible. Platelets are the cells in your blood that are involved in clotting, so aspirin essentially permanently disables some of your platelets, which can reduce the risk of blood clots forming.
And that's why low-dose aspirin is often prescribed to people who are at risk for heart attacks or strokes, right?
Exactly. Ibuprofen, on the other hand, its effect on platelets is reversible, so it doesn't have that same long-term anti-clotting effect. But it also means that ibuprofen is generally considered to be safer when it comes to bleeding risk.
And how do ibuprofen and aspirin compare in terms of their overall effectiveness for pain and inflammation?
In general, they're fairly comparable. Ibuprofen is often preferred for its better GI tolerability. It tends to cause fewer stomach issues than aspirin. But there's one important interaction to be aware of if you happen to be taking both medications.
Oh.
Yeah, if you take ibuprofen before you take low-dose aspirin, it can actually interfere with aspirin's ability to protect your heart.
So the timing of when you take those medications can actually make a difference.
It can. So if you're taking both aspirin and ibuprofen, it's really important to talk to your doctor about the best way to time your doses.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked a lot about NSAIDs, but there's another class of drugs that we should mention here, the TIOX2 inhibitors, or COXIBs.
Right. So COXIBs are a newer class of NSAIDs that were specifically designed to target the COX2 enzyme while sparing COX-1.
And the thinking behind that was to get the anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving benefits without the stomach side effects, right?
Exactly. And initially, COXIBs were hailed as a major breakthrough in pain management. But then, as often happens with new drugs, some serious safety concerns emerged.
And that led to one of the most well-known COXIBs, rofecoxib or Biaxic, being withdrawn from the market in 2004 due to an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes.
Right. And that really shook up the whole field of pain management and led to a much more cautious approach to all NSAIDs, including ibuprofen.
So how do COXIBs compare to ibuprofen in terms of their overall effectiveness and safety profile?
Well, in terms of effectiveness for pain and inflammation, ibuprofen is actually pretty comparable to most COXIBs. The main differences often come down to things like dosing frequency and the specific side effect profiles. Some people might tolerate ibuprofen better than a COXIB or vice versa.
And in terms of safety, it's still kind of a complex issue, right? I mean, ibuprofen does carry some cardiovascular risks, especially at higher doses or with long-term use, but so do some of the COXIBs.
Yeah, it's a nuanced picture. I think the important thing to remember is that all NSAIDs, whether they're traditional NSAIDs like ibuprofen or COX-2 inhibitors, they all carry some degree of risk, and the best choice for any individual patient is going to depend on their specific circumstances, their medical history, and their risk factors.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here on how ibuprofen works and how it compares to other pain relievers. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about how this stuff is actually made.
Okay, so now we're getting into the realm of chemical engineering and industrial scale manufacturing.
And it's a pretty complex process, right? I mean, it's not like you can just whip up a batch of ibuprofen in your kitchen.
No, not quite. It involves multiple steps, specialized equipment, and a lot of carefully controlled conditions.
Now, our research outlines two main methods for producing ibuprofen: the original Boots synthesis and the BHC process.
Right. So the Boots synthesis is the method that was originally developed by Boots back in the early 1960s, and it's a multi-step process that starts with a compound called isobutylbenzene.
Okay, and I'm guessing this is where things start to get a bit technical.
It can get a little bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it as straightforward as possible. So in the Boots synthesis, isobutylbenzene goes through a series of chemical transformations, including a Friedel-Crafts acylation, a reaction with the sodium azide, a Curtius rearrangement, and finally a hydrolysis step to produce racemic ibuprofen.
And racemic ibuprofen is that mixture of the two enantiomers that we talked about earlier, right?
Exactly. So after all those steps, you end up with a 50-50 mixture of the active S enantiomer and the inactive R enantiomer.
And they have to separate those two forms, right?
They do. And that process is called chiral resolution. It's basically a way of separating the two enantiomers based on their slightly different chemical properties.
And that's important because you want to end up with a product that's mostly, if not entirely, the active form of the drug, right?
Absolutely. Now, the Boots synthesis was a major breakthrough at the time, but it also had some drawbacks. It wasn't the most efficient process in terms of atom economy, which basically means how much of the starting materials end up in the final product versus how much ends up as waste.
So it wasn't the most environmentally friendly process.
Not really, and it also relied on some fairly harsh chemicals like aluminum chloride, which can be difficult to handle and dispose of safely.
So that's where the BHC process comes in, right? It's
Okay.
a more modern and more efficient method for producing ibuprofen.
Exactly. The BHC process was developed in the late 1980s and early 1990s by a consortium of companies, and it's now the most widely used method for producing ibuprofen.
And one of the key differences between the boot synthesis and the BHC process is that the BHC process uses a catalytic reaction.
Yeah. That's right. One of the key steps in the BHC process is a palladium catalyzed carbonylation reaction. Basically, this means that they use a palladium catalyst to help facilitate the reaction, and the catalyst itself doesn't get used up in the process.
So it's like the palladium's kind of like a facilitator. It helps the reaction happen, but it doesn't become part of the final product.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes the BHC process so efficient. You only need a small amount of the catalyst to produce a lot of product.
And it also means that there's less waste, right? Because you're not using up large amounts of potentially harmful chemicals.
Exactly. So the BHC process is not only more efficient, but it's also more environmentally friendly than the Boots synthesis.
And I read that there are even some newer methods for producing ibuprofen that are being explored, some of which are even more sustainable and efficient.
Yeah, there's always research going on to find new and better ways to make pharmaceuticals. Some of the newer methods that are being investigated for ibuprofen production include things like catalytic asymmetric hydrogenation and solvent-free mechanochemical synthesis.
So even though ibuprofen has been around for decades, there's still a lot of innovation happening in the field of how it's produced.
Absolutely. And that's really important because as we become more aware of the environmental impact of chemical manufacturing, we need to constantly be looking for ways to make these processes more sustainable.
All right, so we've seen how ibuprofen is made. Now let's talk about how it's regulated.
Okay, so the regulatory landscape for pharmaceuticals is a complex one. It involves a lot of different agencies and a lot of steps to ensure that drugs are safe and effective before they can be sold to the public.
And ibuprofen's journey through this regulatory maze has been pretty interesting, right? It started out as a prescription-only medication and then eventually made the transition to over-the-counter status.
Exactly. So initially, when ibuprofen was first approved for use in humans back in the late 1960s, it was only available by prescription.
Hmm.
And that's pretty typical for new drugs, you know? Regulatory agencies want to be extra cautious when a drug is first introduced, and they want to make sure that it's being used appropriately and that doctors are monitoring patients for any potential side effects.
Right. And I imagine that the initial focus on chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis also played a role in its initial classification as a prescription-only drug.
Absolutely. I mean, these are serious conditions that require careful management, and it makes sense that regulatory agencies would want to err on the side of caution and make sure that ibuprofen was only being used under the supervision of a doctor.
So what changed that led to its eventual move to over-the-counter status?
Well, as more research was done and as doctors gained more experience with ibuprofen, it became clear that it was generally safe and effective for a wider range of conditions, including things like headaches, muscle aches, and fever.
And those are the kind of conditions that people often
Yeah.
self-treat, right?
Exactly. And as evidence for ibuprofen's safety and efficacy in these more minor conditions accumulated, regulatory agencies started to reconsider its classification.
And in 1983, ibuprofen was approved for over-the-counter sale in the UK.
Right. And the U.S. followed suit a year later in 1984.
And that really opened the door for ibuprofen to become the global blockbuster drug
Yeah.
that it is today, right? I mean, once it became available over the counter, suddenly it was accessible to practically anyone.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's made ibuprofen so successful. It's effective, it's relatively safe when used appropriately, and it's readily available.
But that widespread availability has also led to some concerns, right? Especially as our understanding of the potential risks of NSAIDs has evolved over time.
That's right. One of the biggest areas of concern has been the potential for NSAIDs, including ibuprofen, to increase the risk of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes.
And that led to the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, issuing a black box warning for prescription NSAIDs in 2005, which was later strengthened in 2015.
Yeah, the black box warning is the FDA's strongest warning, and it's reserved for drugs that carry a significant risk of serious or even life-threatening side effects.
And the warning for NSAIDs specifically highlights the increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, and serious gastrointestinal bleeding.
Right. And it's important to note that this warning applies to all NSAIDs, not just ibuprofen.
Now, over-the-counter ibuprofen products don't have the black box warning,
Yeah.
but they do have prominent warnings about the potential risks.
Right. And I think that's really important for people to understand. Even though you can buy ibuprofen over the counter without a prescription, it's still a serious medication that needs to be used responsibly.
Absolutely. Now, in addition to the black box warning, there have been other regulatory actions related to ibuprofen over the years.
Yeah, there have been a number of recalls of ibuprofen products due to various manufacturing issues like contamination or incorrect dosages, and there have also been some labeling changes, to make the warnings about the potential risks clearer and more prominent.
So it's a constantly evolving landscape, right?
Yeah.
As our understanding of ibuprofen and its potential risks and benefits continues to grow, regulatory agencies are constantly reevaluating and adjusting their recommendations.
Exactly. And I think that's a good thing. It means that they're taking the safety of consumers seriously and that they're constantly striving to provide the best possible guidance on how to use these medications safely.
All right, so we've covered the history, we've covered the science, we've covered the manufacturing, we've covered the regulation. I think it's time to dive into some of the controversies and legal issues that have surrounded ibuprofen.
Okay, so ibuprofen has been around for a long time now, and it's been used by millions of people around the world. And as with any widely used medication, there have been some controversies and some legal challenges.
And the main areas of controversy have centered on its safety, right?
Yeah.
Specifically, the potential for gastrointestinal and cardiovascular side effects.
Exactly. So as we discussed earlier, ibuprofen is a non-selective COX inhibitor, which means that it blocks both COX-1 and COX-2. And while blocking COX-2 is what gives ibuprofen its anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving effects, blocking COX-1 can lead to some unwanted side effects, particularly in the gastrointestinal tract.
Right. And one of the main functions of COX-1 is to protect the lining of the stomach from the damaging effects of stomach acid.
Exactly. So when you block COX-1, you essentially reduce the production of these protective prostaglandins, and that can increase the risk of stomach irritation, ulcers, and even bleeding.
And that's why ibuprofen can sometimes cause heartburn, indigestion, and in more serious cases, it can even lead to ulcers or bleeding in the stomach or intestines.
Right. Now, the risk of these GI side effects is generally higher with higher doses of ibuprofen and with longer term use. It's also higher in people who have a history of GI problems like ulcers or gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD.
And it's also higher in people who are taking other medications that can also irritate the stomach, like aspirin or corticosteroids.
Exactly. So if you're taking ibuprofen, it's important to be aware of these potential risks and to talk to your doctor if you have any concerns or if you experience any side effects.
Absolutely. Now, the cardiovascular risks associated with ibuprofen have also been a major area of controversy.
Yeah, the cardiovascular risks really came to the forefront in the early 2000s when Vioxx, the COX-2 inhibitor, was withdrawn from the market due to an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes.
And that really raised concerns about the cardiovascular safety of all NSAIDs, including ibuprofen.
It did, and subsequent research has shown that ibuprofen, like other NSAIDs, can increase the risk of cardiovascular events, especially at higher doses and with long-term use.
And the risk is also higher in people who already have some underlying cardiovascular risk factors like high blood pressure or high cholesterol.
Right. But it's important to note that the overall risk of a cardiovascular event from ibuprofen is still relatively low, especially at the lower doses that are typically used for over-the-counter pain relief.
And the benefits of ibuprofen, the pain relief and the anti-inflammatory effects, they often outweigh the risks, especially for short-term use.
Exactly. But again, it's really important to use ibuprofen responsibly and to talk to your doctor if you have any concerns or if you have any pre-existing conditions.
So given these controversies over ibuprofen safety, it's not surprising that there have been some legal challenges as well.
That's right. There have been a number of lawsuits filed against the manufacturers of ibuprofen, alleging that the the drug caused harm to patients.
And some of these lawsuits have been successful, right?
Some of them have, but I think it's important to put these lawsuits in context. There have been millions, if not billions, of people who have used ibuprofen safely and effectively over the years.
Right, and the vast majority of people who take ibuprofen don't experience any serious side effects.
Exactly. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are some people who are more susceptible to the potential side effects of